Good to have you here again. I'm Matthew. After 2026, Everest gets a reset. And today, I'm looking at exactly what made that necessary. From a cue that made a man miss his turnaround by hours, to another man clipping into a rope that had been freezing and thawing all winter, with nothing ahead but a traverse and a slowly failing anchor. It was May 22nd, 2016. The southeast ridge of Everest sits above 26,000 feet, what climbers call the death zone. And on that particular morning, it was packed. A rare weather window had opened, and somewhere between 150 and 200 climbers were on the same route, moving in the same direction, within the same narrow time frame. From the western CWM below, the line of headlamps threading the ridge in the pre-dawn dark looked almost organized. Up close, it was a bottleneck with no exit. Jareth Collum was 38 years old, a wildland firefighter from Portland, Oregon. His entire career was built around reading dangerous terrain and knowing when to commit and when to back off. So he wasn't walking into this blind. 3 years of preparation, 2 prior Himalayan expeditions, a certified guide for the summit push, and a full acclimatization rotation done properly. Before leaving Camp 4, he set a hard turnaround time of 1 p.m. and told his guide to hold him to it, no exceptions. No matter where they were on the mountain. Do you know what actually happens to your body above 26,000 feet? It's not just exhaustion. Your brain is starved of oxygen, and it starts to show, slowly, quietly, in ways you won't notice until it's already too late. The air up there holds roughly a third of what's available at sea level. Every hour you stay, the deficit compounds. You don't feel yourself slipping. That's the part that makes it dangerous. Jareth's team reached the balcony at around 27,600 feet by 6 a.m. and ran straight into a wall. Not a weather wall, a human one. A line of climbers packed onto a ridge barely wide enough for the single file movement, with no room to pass and nowhere to go around. His guide looked for a gap, tried to find a way past the slower groups ahead. There wasn't one. 3 guided teams were barely moving, clients fumbling with fixed rope technique, some stopping entirely to rest in place on the line. An hour passed, then another. By 9 a.m., they had gained less than 400 feet. His 1 p.m. turnaround came and went while he was still below the south summit. His guide called it. Jareth refused. From where he stood, the summit looked close. Deceptively close. What most people don't realize is that the south summit sits at around 28,700 feet and appears to be the top from below, but the true summit is still roughly a quarter mile of exposed ridge beyond it. Jareth could see what looked like the top. He pushed. He summited at around 2:10 p.m. By that point, he had been above 26,000 feet for over 8 hours. The descent started immediately, but the damage from that kind of sustained exposure doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly while you're focused on everything else. On the way down, his guide noticed it before Jareth did. His movements had become slower and less deliberate. Not exhaustion, slow, but something different. A slight lag between instruction and response. His footwork on the fixed rope was losing its precision. His guide stayed close and kept talking to him, trying to keep him engaged. Then somewhere between the south summit and the balcony, Jareth sat down on the fixed rope and stopped. His guide asked him why. He couldn't answer. His supplemental oxygen wasn't depleted. He hadn't fallen. He had simply been up there too long, and his brain was showing it. His guide and a Sherpa, descending nearby, tried to get him moving. They could keep him partially upright, but he couldn't coordinate his legs well enough to make real downward progress. They worked him as far as the top of the Hillary step. It was approaching 4:30 p.m., over 10 hours in the death zone. The step had partially collapsed after the 2015 earthquake and was more of a broken scramble by then. But honestly, there is no way to lower or carry a non-functional climber down that terrain without killing everyone attempting it. His guide stayed with him for as long as conditions allowed, attempting to keep him alert and upright. Jareth was still breathing, but unresponsive to instruction. With daylight fading and temperature dropping rapidly, his guide made the call to descend for a rescue team and left him clipped to the rope. He reached Camp 4 and radioed for assistance at approximately 5:30 p.m. A small team was dispatched back up immediately. By the time they reached his position, Jareth was gone. Jareth's body was recovered from the fixed rope the following morning by a team that had staged at Camp 4 overnight. His GPS device, oxygen regulator, and personal pack were retrieved alongside him. The GPS data logged his position every 15 minutes and showed he had stopped moving entirely at approximately 5:10 p.m. The post-expedition report placed his total time in the death zone at over 10 hours. His guide's testimony confirmed the turnaround time was missed due to queue delays outside their control. Cause of death was recorded as high-altitude cerebral edema. Contributing factors listed were prolonged exposure in the death zone exceeding 10 hours, delayed turnaround resulting from route congestion, and progressive neurological deterioration consistent with sustained hypoxia. No equipment failure was identified. No weather event occurred. The GPS data and guide testimony were the primary evidence on record. Jareth's case became one of the clearest arguments for why headcount on the mountain on any given summit day has to be a controlled number, not a function of how many permits were sold. A queue that nobody built and nobody managed cost him the turnaround window his guide was supposed to hold. The 2026 framework's permit caps and staggered departure windows exist, in part because of exactly that. It was April 14th, 2017. The Khumbu icefall begins just above base camp at roughly 17,600 feet on Everest's southwest face, a slow-moving river of glacial ice broken into towers and walls called seracs, some of them the size of multi-story buildings, all of them shifting and settling on their own schedule. Permitted teams are assigned specific crossing windows, typically between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m., time to avoid the warmer mid-morning hours when melt accelerates serac instability. Even within those windows, teams move fast and don't linger. Oscar Duell was 31 years old, an offshore oil rig worker from Boise, Idaho. Physical risk wasn't foreign to him. Rig work builds that tolerance fast. He was fit, strong, and used to operating in environments that could kill you if you made the wrong call. That probably worked against him here. He had 2 Himalayan treks behind him, neither above 20,000 feet, and had applied for an Everest permit the previous year. Rejected. Insufficient documented high-altitude experience under a review process that was tightening every season. To requalify, he would have needed at least one documented summit above 21,000 feet, which meant another expedition, another season, another year. Most people would go back, build the resume, reapply. Oscar didn't. He told one friend he was heading out on a high-altitude photography trip, packed his gear, and showed up at base camp with no guide, no support team, and no registered itinerary with any operator on the mountain. The icefall isn't a static obstacle. It's a moving one. The glacier creeps downhill continuously, and the pressure that creates causes collapses nobody can predict. Route-fixing teams maintain a system of ladders and fixed ropes through the safest available path, updated regularly as the ice shifts. That information doesn't circulate outside. Permitted teams, someone going in alone, has no way of knowing where the current safe line actually runs. They're navigating blind. Oscar entered the icefall alone at approximately 2 a.m. outside the permitted window, hours before the route-fixing teams would be active. He was carrying a full pack with a tent, food, and camera gear, for enough to suggest he was planning to push above the icefall and camp without being detected. No other headlamps were in the icefall that morning. No teams, no Sherpas, nobody near him, just Oscar and the ice. His GPS data shows he had studied the route. He was moving with purpose, but he had no way of knowing whether the path he was following matched the current safe line. At around 3:20 a.m., a serac cluster in the upper icefall collapsed. There's no slow build with these things. No cracking, no warning. One moment the ice is there, the next it isn't. The debris field that came down covered an estimated 300-foot section of the route, burying everything beneath several meters of fractured ice. People at base camp heard it. A deep, concussive sound, followed by a low rumble. Nobody went to check. Serac collapses happen regularly, and the standard response is to assess during the morning window. There was no reason to connect that sound to a person. Nobody knew Oscar was out there. When the first permitted teams entered the icefall at around 4:30 a.m., they found a section of the fixed rope route buried under fresh ice debris. A crampon and part of a backpack frame were visible at the edge of the field. The teams marked the location and reported it upon return to base camp. 5 days later, the friend Oscar had told about the trip. Contact the trekking agency Oscar had used to arrange his base camp access. After receiving no communication, the agency flagged it to operators on the mountain, who cross-referenced it against the debris field discovery and initiated a search. It ran for 2 days. The debris field was too deep and structurally unstable to excavate safely. Any attempt risked triggering further collapse. Oscar's body was never recovered. His pack, 1 crampon, a handheld GPS unit, and his camera were pulled from the surface. The GPS placed his last recorded position at 3:18 a.m., roughly 200 feet into the Serac field. The final image on his camera, time-stamped 3:09 a.m., showed the interior of the icefall angled upward toward a leaning Serac tower. His name was on no permit, no expedition manifest, no operator log. Cause of death was recorded as traumatic compression and burial, consistent with Serac collapse. Contributing factors included unsupported solo entry, no registered communication device, and movement through an active Serac zone during high-risk pre-dawn hours without current route information. The case was closed as an unregistered fatality. The GPS data and recovered camera were the only evidence on record. His body was never retrieved. His name was on no permit, no manifest, no operator log, and that was the problem. A rejected permit meant nothing if someone determined enough could arrange base camp access through a trekking agency and walk in before anyone knew they were there. The 2026 framework's tighter base camp verification requirements and mandatory operator accountability exist because Oscar's case proved the gap was real and the consequences were permanent. It was May 18, 2017. Camp 3 on Everest's southeast ridge sits at approximately 23,500 feet on the Lhotse face, a near vertical wall of blue ice that connects the western CWM to the upper mountain. At that elevation, the air holds roughly 40% of the oxygen available at sea level. Most teams spend a single night there at most before pushing up or retreating to a lower camp. It is not a place designed for rest. The longer you stay, the more it costs you. Eric Brigg was 34 years old, a travel and adventure photographer based out of Austin, Texas. 5 years of building a following of just over 400,000. Desert crossings, jungle routes, high-altitude passes in the Andes, and the Karakoram. The highest he'd ever been before Everest was 18,510 feet on Island Peak in Nepal. Island Peak is a solid objective, don't get me wrong, but it is nowhere near the preparation Everest actually demands. He wasn't a casual creator, but he was also not a high-altitude climber, and honestly, that gap matters more on Everest than on any other mountain I can think of. Everest was his defining project, a multi-part visual documentary 8 months in the making, sponsors attached, posting schedule locked in. His audience knew his summit push date before he'd even left base camp. So what actually happens to your lungs above 23,000 feet? Fluid builds up, slowly, quietly, as the body struggles to cope with oxygen levels it was never designed for. A dry, persistent cough. Fatigue that doesn't match the effort. Breathlessness at rest. The signs are easy to dismiss individually, but together they mean one thing: get down. Every hour above the onset point without descending narrows the window significantly. Eric's team ran the standard acclimatization rotations before committing to the push. Base camp to Camp 2 and back twice, with a single night at Camp 3 on the second rotation. No symptoms throughout. His guide cleared him. Eric posted about how well his body was handling the altitude. Better than expected, he wrote. Everything through Camp 3 on summit day was unremarkable. The symptoms appeared on his second night at Camp 3. The tent was small and cold, 2 people pressed into a narrow space at 23,500 feet, with the wind working at the fabric walls, the kind of conditions where you notice everything about the person next to you. His climbing partner noted the cough in a later statement. Dry, frequent, worsening through the night. Eric posted from Camp 3 that evening. The caption described the cold, the altitude, the anticipation. He did not mention the cough. The following morning, his pace toward Camp 4 was noticeably slower than the rest of his team. Not exhaustion slow, but the kind of slow that doesn't match the terrain or the conditions. His guide pulled him aside and recommended a rotation back down to Camp 2 for evaluation. Eric dismissed it. He told his guide the symptoms were normal altitude adjustment, that his body was just catching up. He had announced the summit date to his audience 11 days prior, and a retreat, even a temporary one, was not something he was willing to post about. His guide noted the exchange in his post-expedition statement. By the time he reached Camp 4 at 26,000 feet, his breathing was audibly labored. His guide gave a direct instruction to descend that afternoon. Eric asked for one night on supplemental oxygen, convinced he could stabilize. What he didn't know, or chose not to acknowledge, was that the cough had already changed. It was no longer dry. His guide recognized what that meant. Fluid was accumulating in his lungs, and supplemental oxygen alone was not going to reverse it. The only thing that reverses it at that stage is descent. He was found unresponsive in his tent at Camp 4 at approximately 5 a.m. the following morning by his climbing partner. His guide attempted resuscitation. It was too late. A distress call was made from Camp 4 at approximately 5:20 a.m. No helicopter evacuation is possible at 26,000 feet. The air is too thin to generate sufficient rotor lift at that altitude. The call was logged, but there was nothing to be done. A Sherpa team coordinated the body recovery from Camp 4. Weather and terrain made the bring down slow. It took 2 days to get Eric from Camp 4 to base camp. His camera, GPS unit, and satellite communicator were retrieved alongside him. The camera had 34 images from Camp 4, the last time stamped at 11:47 p.m. His satellite communicator had one unsent draft to his manager, noting a 1-day delay to the summit push. Never sent. His manager had no idea anything was wrong until the distress call came in. The post-expedition medical assessment placed symptom onset at least 36 hours before death, with no descent initiated, despite a direct guide recommendation. Cause of death was recorded as high-altitude pulmonary edema. Contributing factors listed were delayed descent, refusal of guide instruction, and continued ascent to Camp 4 despite deteriorating respiratory condition. The guide's statement, satellite communicator draft, and time-stamped camera images were the primary evidence on record. This was one of several mid-2010s incidents involving sponsored climbers whose external commitments directly influenced their decisions at altitude. The 2026 framework's stricter guide requirements and experience thresholds were shaped in part by cases like his. Incidents where outside pressure overrode judgment at altitude in ways the existing rules had no mechanism to prevent. His guide gave direct instruction. It carried no enforceable weight. That's the gap the framework was written to close. New here, hit subscribe if you haven't already. We're only halfway through, and the back half of this episode is where it gets really uncomfortable. It was May 23rd, 2017. The upper mountain above Camp 4 on Everest's southeast ridge sits fully exposed to the jet stream, a band of high-altitude wind that shifts north of the summit in late May, opening the narrow windows that make summit attempts possible. Those windows had been running shorter and less predictable in recent seasons. The forecasting models in use were built on decades of historical data, and by 2017 the mountain was beginning to move outside the patterns that data described. Brian Gill was 41 years old, a backcountry ski guide from Missoula, Montana. His job was reading avalanche terrain, managing clients in whiteout conditions, making fast calls in environments that punish hesitation. Mountain weather wasn't abstract to him. It was his livelihood. Everest had been a personal goal he'd been building towards since his early 30s. He'd summited Denali and Aconcagua in prior years and approached this the same way he approached everything, methodically. Full acclimatization rotation, reputable guiding service, every decision made by the book. His forecasting service confirmed a stable window from May 24th through May 27th, winds under 20 miles per hour at the summit. The window held exactly as predicted on May 24th. Conditions stable, wind low, nothing to suggest the model was off. He launched his summit push from Camp 4 at 11 p.m. that night, with every reason to trust the forecast. By 3 a.m., he was above 27,500 feet and moving well within his projected pace. The wind picked up slightly around 4:30 a.m., but stayed within acceptable range. He reached the south summit at approximately 6:15 a.m. and continued toward the true summit, clearing it at around 7 a.m. The sky was clear. He turned around immediately and began his descent. Shortly after beginning his descent, the wind arrived. The jet stream drops back onto the summit ridge from the west, and when it does, there's no gradual build. It hits. By 7:15 a.m., winds on the ridge had climbed past 45 miles per hour. By 7:30 a.m., they were above 60 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 70. At that altitude, wind that strong drives ice crystals horizontally, cuts visibility to almost nothing, and makes every movement a negotiation. The temperature dropped sharply. Bryle was on the ridge, just below the summit, when the full force of it arrived. There is no position on that section of the ridge where you can wait anything out. You move, or the mountain decides for you. His guide called the turn and pushed the descent hard, but getting a client down from that position in those conditions, above 28,000 feet, at the edge of their physical capacity, isn't a controlled descent. It's a managed deterioration. Bryle kept moving, but his guide noticed his response time to verbal instructions was increasing, a beat too slow, then two. His posture was dropping, his movements losing their precision in a way that had nothing to do with the terrain. His body was losing heat faster than it could generate it, and the wind wasn't letting up. He stopped on the fixed rope above the balcony at approximately 9:40 a.m. at around 27,600 feet. His guide tried to keep him upright and moving. It wasn't working. Bryle was still breathing, but unresponsive to instruction. A distress call went out from the guide's radio at approximately 10 a.m. A rescue team departed Camp 4 at around 10:30 a.m. His guide stayed until staying was no longer viable without putting himself at the same risk, then descended to meet the team and lead them back up. They reached Bryle's position at approximately 1:30 p.m. and found him still clipped to the fixed rope, unresponsive, no signs of life. His body was recovered 2 days later during a weather break, still on the fixed rope above the balcony. His down suit showed no damage. His oxygen system was intact. His GPS logged his last movement at approximately 10:15 a.m. The post-expedition report noted he had done everything correctly: acclimatization, pacing, turnaround call, equipment. Cause of death was recorded as hypothermia secondary to acute wind exposure at high altitude. Contributing factors listed were rapid jet stream repositioning, approximately 6 hours ahead of any projected timeline, sustained wind speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour above 28,000 feet, and no viable descent route fast enough to outpace the deteriorating conditions. The forecasting service acknowledged in their internal review that the model had failed to capture the repositioning event within any actionable warning window. Bryle's GPS data, oxygen equipment, and guide testimony were the primary evidence on record. Bryle's case sits in a different category from the others. He didn't make a bad decision. He didn't bypass a rule or ignore a warning. He trusted a forecasting system that failed to capture what the mountain actually did that morning, 6 hours outside any projected window. His case doesn't point to a permit gap or an enforcement failure. It points to the outer edge of what any framework can actually control, and that's the part that stays with you. It was May 11, 2018. The northeast ridge of Everest, approached from the Tibetan side, is a longer and more technically exposed route than the standard southeast ridge out of Nepal. Above 27,000 feet, it narrows into a series of rock steps requiring genuine technical climbing, with near vertical drops on both sides and limited margin for error. In 2018, sections of the upper northeast ridge were under active review by permitting authorities following a series of incidents on unpatrolled stretches above the second step. The regulatory changes that would formally restrict access to those sections were finalized, but not yet in effect. Keith Weil was 44 years old, an underground mine engineer from Flagstaff, Arizona. Narrow tunnels, unstable rock, systems that could fail without warning. That was his daily work environment. He'd summited the Southeast Ridge in 2014 and wanted the Northeast Ridge as a second route, a personal benchmark, nothing more. He applied for and received his permit in late 2017, months before the regulatory review concluded. By the time the new restrictions were formalized, his permit was already valid and non-refundable. So what do you do when the section the new rules were specifically written to close off is the exact section your approved route passes through? Keith's answer was to proceed anyway. The Northeast Ridge, above 27,800 feet, has significantly less fixed rope infrastructure than the Southeast Ridge. Fewer teams, less traffic, less maintenance, and problems that go undetected a lot longer because of it. In 2018, the rope above the third step hadn't been inspected or re-anchored that season. The team contracted to service it had pulled out early due to logistical issues unrelated to conditions. Keith's guide flagged this before they left base camp. Keith acknowledged it, noted the risk, and kept the departure on schedule. His team followed the standard Tibetan side approach, North Col at around 23,000 feet, then camps established progressively up the Northeast Ridge over several days. May 11th was a clear morning. Conditions calm, wind low on the upper ridge. They reached the second step at approximately 5:30 a.m. The fixed ladder on the near vertical rock face was intact, and they cleared it without incident. Above the second step, the terrain opens briefly, before narrowing again toward the third step, a short but genuinely technical mixed section of rock and ice at approximately 28,870 feet. The fixed rope on the approach to the third step was present, but visibly weathered. Keith's guide examined the first anchor point and noted it felt loose but held when tested. He told Keith directly. The rope was old, the anchor was questionable, and the section had seen no maintenance that season. Keith was a mine engineer. He knew what a compromised anchor looked like. He also knew his permit was valid, the window was open, and the summit was within reach. He decided the anchor would hold. He clipped in and began the traverse. Approximately 40 feet into the section, an anchor pulled from the rock. Freeze-thaw cycling over the winter had worked it loose from its placement, a process that happens gradually and invisibly until the load is applied. The rope went slack. Keith had no secondary anchor point in place at that moment. There was nothing to catch him. He fell approximately 300 feet down the north face before the terrain flattened enough to arrest his movement. His guide, still below the failed anchor point, witnessed the fall and was unable to reach Keith's position safely. The north face below the third step is not terrain a single climber can descend to conduct a rescue at that altitude. A distress call went out from the guide's radio at approximately 7:15 a.m. No rescue team could access that position at that altitude and terrain configuration. Keith's location was identified visually by his guide from above and confirmed by a separate team 2 days later during a weather window. His body remained on the north face. Recovery at that position was not viable. The failed anchor section of fixed rope was retrieved by Keith's guide on the descent and examined at base camp. Cause of death was recorded as fatal traumatic injuries sustained in a high-altitude fall. Contributing factors listed were anchor failure on uninspected fixed rope, absence of secondary protection at the point of failure, and passage through a section flagged for closure under the incoming regulatory framework. The anchor examination confirmed freeze-thaw loosening, consistent with a full winter without maintenance. His permit was valid. The route was approved. The rope had not been touched since the previous season. The guide's radio log, recovered anchor, section, and Keith's GPS data were the primary evidence on record. His permit was valid. The route was approved. The rope hadn't been touched since the previous season. None of that was illegal. And that's exactly the problem. The 2026 framework's mandatory fixed rope inspection requirements before each season's permitted window opens exist because Keith's case made clear that infrastructure accountability couldn't be left to the teams contracted to maintain it. When those teams pull out, the rope stays, and the next person to clip in has no way of knowing what a full winter did to the anchor.